Well, good morning, everybody. It's just click 9:01, and we're here from NEC, so we should be doing things on time. My name is Richard Patterson, and I've been honoured to be asked to chair the session today. This is
Unknown participant is now joining.
This is the second day of this year's first ever, probably online NEC annual conference. We had a good day yesterday, and we're starting off today. We have for you two case studies. Firstly, a session on the what seems to have been rather successful A400M delivery. Then a session on a significant hangar project for the DIO, Defence Infrastructure Organisation. And we'll finish off with a session on another new colour. We'll find out from Ross what colour it's going to be. A new contract, specifically designed for facilities management. So that's the three sessions we've got for you this morning. A little bit of detail will come on the slides as we go in a moment. As if by magic, Cheryl, thank you. She's in the background helping us out. In terms of housekeeping, usual format, please turn your mics off at the moment. If and when you do want to ask a question, please either use the chat function on Teams. If you'd rather ask your question directly, then please either say so in the chat function and/or use the hands up function. I'm very keen to get you to talk to people just like we would in Great George Street on a normal day. Usual story. Thank you very much to all the various sponsors that are supporting the event today. I'm not going to read them out. I'll let you. Okay, so I'll now hand over, please. We've got to say two people. We've got. We'll start off with Graham. Graham is the lead for Highways England, the commercial lead for delivering what's around about 1.5 billion. That's a big number. 1.5 billion A14 Cambridge to Huntingdon improvement scheme. Very close to my heart because I've been doing 40 mile an hour through there for several years. He's then be backed up by John McRae, who's the commercial director for Balfour Beatty on the scheme. As we'll see, one of several contractors involved to deliver this fairly substantial piece of UK infrastructure.
Unknown participant is now joining.
Is that unknown participant still joining? So Graham, take it away, please.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I think you've stolen my thunder. So you've given me an adequate introduction. Graham Cole, A14 lead for the commercial lead for Highways England. John, over to you.
Good morning all, and I hope you're all well. As I say, our opening presentation today will be associated with the A14 Cambridge to Huntingdon improvement scheme for Highways England, with a particular focus on our new commercial model. So before commencing, as I say, Graham is the head of commercial delivery for Highways England and joined the scheme back in October F17. And likewise myself, I joined at the same time, and I'm the contractor's commercial director. So we can start by just setting the scene. Graham will provide an overview of the project to give you all a feel for the scale and the scope of the works. I'll then talk about the original contract model and the benefits of using NEC. And then Graham will then describe the new commercial model, and we'll finish up with a review of the benefits and the lessons learned by all parties before opening up to any questions.
Okay, so for setting the scene, on that very minuscule, I hope you got your microscopes there, but the map in the top right-hand corner shows the scheme. It is about just under £1.5 billion, going from the top left at Alconbury on the A1 through to Milton at the bottom right of that map, which makes the connection from the north and from the Midlands through to Felixstowe Port. A lot of the traffic is heavy goods vehicles heading to and from Felixstowe. The purpose of spending the £1.5 billion was to improve the journey time by about 20 minutes. The original construction there were 3 original construction contracts which were let in 2015, and work on site started in 2016. The open for traffic on all the 5 sections geographically located from Auchenbury to Milton, started in 2016. The public opening date was always December 20, but we've been able to open all of the 5 sections early May, so spring 2020, so that's good. That leaves Section 6, which is deep trunking work, taking down bridges over the East Coast Main Line and doing improvement works around Huntingdon, which will complete in end of 2021. So that's a really basic summary. We'll go into a bit more later on, but over to you, John.
Thank you, Graham. So if we begin by reviewing the original contract model that was in place on the scheme, the NEC 3 option C target cost contract with an activity schedule was used as the basis between the parties, and this was the contract of choice in line with other schemes insofar that the expectations were that it would generally provide clarity, simplicity and flexibility for the use of all, plus stimulate good project management, promote appropriate behaviours and share the outturn financial risks between the parties. Now, due to the existing procurement restrictions within the client's organisation and a limit of 450 million per package, 3 packages were awarded to the contracting organisations, with packages 1 and 2 to a Costain Skanska joint venture and package 3 to a Balfour BT Carillion joint venture. So it's viewed that this package arrangement would seek synergy between the JV parties, providing some consistency and alignment across the scheme, but still require the demonstration of entitlement with all parties, still considered to be incentivised by the overall scheme budget. Next slide, please. So this slide, this hopefully provides a clear indication of the original contract model in a pictorial manner. So following award of these 3 individual packages, after a period of time, it appeared that there wasn't the expected alignment across the scheme that was envisaged. So following the introduction of our deed of variation number 1 in July 2017, this amalgamated the 3 packages into one all-inclusive package. So you can see that with the dotted line around the 3 blue squares, which represent each of the packages. And that was alongside the designer, and this team came to be known as the Integrated Delivery Team. So this arrangement, it was introduced during what we know as stage 5, the development phase, and prior to commencement of stage 6, the construction phase. It provided a consistent approach across the scheme with the intention of maximising best practice from the 4 contracting organisations for the betterment of the scheme. But from a contractor's perspective, they were known as a project-wide joint venture, for which they're known as of today. And there were no changes to the tier 2s or suppliers. It was just at tier 1 level where this arrangement was made in order to try and provide this synergy, but unfortunately, on reflection, wouldn't maximise the knowledge of those tier 2. So following on from our new arrangement at the time of deed of variation number 1, and focusing on specific issues experienced during the stage 5 development phase, there were government issues still remained within the contracting organisation, and although it was seen as one integrated team within a project-wide joint venture, there were still 4 competing parties, all believing that they were more proficient than the other. There was a perception that the designer was working with the client to an incentivised model to optimise their design for the benefit of themselves alone. And there was also this reluctance and lack of understanding from the contractor at this stage to accept that any savings achieved would potentially generate a gain share for all. The reality of well, why give away all our best ideas at this stage when we could potentially maximise our return during construction. Performance metrics within the model didn't promote the right behaviours. There was still this traditional relationship of them and us. But also there appeared to be a lack of understanding by all parties to share opportunities at this stage of the scheme. So moving on to stage 6, the construction phase, and this was from August 2016 to October 2017. The challenges and the behaviours that were being previously experienced during stage 5, they rolled over into stage 6 for construction. And the contractor's view remained that all additional costs on the scheme were fundamentally the client's risks. And this was primarily associated with additional archaeology and the non-performance of statutory undertakers. Then to counter this, the client's view was that all additional costs were caused by the contractor's inefficiencies. Thus, the parties were starting to become entrenched. To paint a picture, hundreds of unimplemented CEs were being raised by the contractor and nothing was being resolved. So as early works progressed, the contractor expressed a projection on the scheme budget, and it would increase from an affordable 1.35 billion, for which the budget was in place, to over 1.6 billion. Without a lot of detail because of the concern for each party. And as a consequence, there was no commercial information shared. There appeared to be 2 sets of books to support each other's vastly different commercial positions. All the energy from both parties was unnecessarily being focused on demonstrating greater or reduced entitlement. And this was limiting the energy on finding the safest and least costly solution to address the problems encountered. So therefore, the scene was set for a long and drawn out process, for which I'm sure we're all familiar with. But the parties on this occasion, were they prepared to do something different for the benefit of all? So on that, I'll hand you over to Graham.
Okay, so as John says, and the slide previous, it said we're about to go to war, and neither of the parties, Highways England nor the contracting organisations, were confident in their position. So we had to do something different. We had to do something different, otherwise it would have been lose-lose for everyone. So from October 17, we tried to put together a model which was based around NEC 3, option C. But what we wanted to do was take the focus away from the entitlement bit and make everybody's focus, contractor and client, on delivering safely for the minimum cost. And so we, between October 17 and April 18, went into a model which deleted the whole of the change section in its entirety from NEC 3. So that the revised budget, which we agreed at 1,435 million, could not be changed for whatever reason. If we could find a way of reducing the number of assets needed to get the travelling public from one end to the other, to take out a bridge, then we would both benefit from the saving that would generate. Equally, if we needed another bridge to go in to get the travelling public through, then that would affect both the overall budget and the contractor's cost. So it was a true buy-in to the overall scheme, not just the contractor's cost, but the overall scheme project budget was fixed, and to deliver all of the scope, all of the assets that were required. To enable that, we also changed the employer and contractor risk splits into just project risks. So everybody had the incentive to work on those risks to find the best, the safest, and the least cost solutions to any problems that there were. The contractor is obviously incentivized by less cost equaled increased profit, and we in Highways England were incentivised by not having to go back to DFT begging for more money. So this is the commercial model that we ended up with. The green line that starts off plateau on the right, goes upwards. That's the profit return, the yield that would be made by the contractor. And the model basically shows the 1435 at the base fee. If the budget went over, if we weren't able to control the costs, the profit level and the fee level for the contractors would go down, but it would plateau. And it would plateau at a zero profit level, where if the costs kept going up, then contractor would be entitled to what we called a zero profit fee. So they would cover their overheads, but they wouldn't get any return for their shareholders. On the good side, towards the left, if the costs went down, the the returns would go up, and not just the fee percentage, but through gain share mechanisms and KPIs, which are aligned with the Highways England imperatives of safety, customer and delivery. So in this, by April 18, we were in a position where we agreed the heads of terms on the new commercial and contractual model. As I say, the lower the cost, the higher the profit for the contractor. So it was truly a win-win rather than a lose-lose, which was where we were going previously. All energy is spent on finding the safest least cost solution, and equally important, there's a balanced position where if we win, so does the contractor. If we lose as the client, so does the contractor. So it is absolutely balanced in the new model. And with the project risks rather than contractor and employer risks, no matter what the risk was, no matter who used to have ownership of it, the best person, whether in the contracting organisation or within Highways England, was set to find the best solution. John mentioned that in October 17, which was the first week I was there, 1.6 billion, one sheet of paper, nothing more, was what the contractor was showing. Since the new model, there is no need to try to protect one another's positions. There is only one position, there is only one source of truth, and there is full sharing of information. I have sight of all of the contractor's costs, and the contractor has sight of all of the Highways England's costs, because we are all incentivized to deliver the overall project budget, not just our own part of it. We hope, it would appear, that has maximised the win-win, minimised that win-lose or lose-lose mentality. Next slide, please. Lessons learned. John, I don't know whether you want to come in here. It's not perfect. It is much better. We have got to a position now where we're close to the end of the project, and we are still targeting the 1435 that was million, which was set in April 18. But there are still lessons to be learned, and one thing is that we're humans, and we're all used to behaving in the way that we've always behaved. So there needs to be a sort of a constant messaging down through all the troops about it is about win-win. We're not competing with one another, and so that message, whenever you think it is fully embedded, you find that it isn't. So it does need constant messaging about that win-win mentality, which I haven't been used to, and a lot of my compatriots haven't. John, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, from a contracting organisation, on this scheme, there were originally 4 contractors involved in the project-wide joint venture.
Yes.
And it was quite unique to actually disengage from who you actually work for to be in this one team mentality in A14, and the relationships and the behaviours that creates. And I think that the priority is that the right message is, for me, is communicated from the top, which we're quite blessed on our scheme in respect of we had suitable project directors with the appropriate behaviours. They were able to portray that message down through the team, of which everybody's then looked up to and bought into. So I think that's paramount. But yeah, I expect it's a success for all.
So lastly, the only thing I would add would be, if I had my time again, it would be making sure that the designers were also involved in that one team approach, which we focused all totally on the contracting organisations and didn't spend too much time on the designer. And also, I think that if we had in that sharing environment the key tier 2 subcontractors, that again would have been beneficial with 2020 hindsight.
Yeah, good.
So I think that's about it.
Yeah, Graham, John, thank you very much. I've been a naughty chairman and let you spill over by a few minutes, but never mind. Any burning questions from anybody out there on the straightaway? We will have a wrap-up question session after all of the 3 sessions. Do you want to? Okay, I have got some questions. Okay. So Graham and John think the project could have been procured on the basis of that joined up thinking that was essentially put in place. In other words, could we have manage to find a procurement route to come up with that sort of model in the first place?
No, I think you have to get to that problematic stage. We were fortunate by then you had detailed design in place, so it made it much easier. And I don't think that the belief was there either within Highways England or within the contracting organisations that this would work.
Okay. It's interesting. There's a follow-up question here, Graham. Sorry to interrupt, but follow-up question, which is obviously pushing the way that some big clients are going with NEC. So this is from Hayley Drever. Thank you. You talk about hindsight. If you're undertaking the project now, would you consider the NEC Alliance contract, which of course is an everybody in it together single contract?
Yes. I think the answer is a simple yes. We definitely would. I think there are still issues around entitlement and how much effort you put into demonstrating entitlement rather than focusing totally on trying to minimise cost between the contracting and the client organisations. But yes, definitely so. John, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think on A14 we had to get to that tipping point where we were either entrenched and we were going to go our separate ways, or we were going to do it together. And I think that on reflection, some of the larger civil schemes around the country, the likes of LTC and HS2 and that, they've all shown a big interest in terms of the model and how it's worked, so that they can implement it from the beginning rather than partway through the job.
Okay, I got two completely opposite end questions here. One from my friend Mr. Gerard, who's coming to us from Hong Kong. Did you find out stress and illness levels of staff before and after this change? Was there any monitoring of just how good it was for people? I'm going to guess that you didn't probably have a major survey of that, but I don't know, maybe you did, or maybe there's some anecdotal stories about what it was like to work before and after.
I'm not sure we have the metrics of before and after. We definitely have been. I arrived in October 17, and we do monitor mental health and stress levels and illness levels of all staff. What I don't know, I can go away and find out if the guy would like to get in touch with me, whether we have that clear, before and after type of consideration.
Okay, one more detailed one from Ian Heafy. In all this sorting it all out at the end, did you change or remove or have any tweaks to the NEC's definition of disallowed cost? Was there still some monitoring of disallowed cost in the stage 6 when we're all in this together? Was there still a disallowed cost mechanism?
Yes, a very clear disallowed cost around labour, plant, materials and subcontractors. The tier 2 contractors have each contract with their own set of rules. With the tier 1 contractor, there are reviews to make sure that the correct amount is paid for staff, for direct plant and materials. So yeah, there is disallowed cost when appropriate.
Okay, slightly negative way to end things, but listen, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm going to have to move on because I'm failing hopelessly as a chairperson because I've gone 10 minutes over in the first 20. So thank you very much for your time. Okay, so I'll start the chatting as we go. The next session, we have a presentation on a client that I'm currently working for as well. So I'll be interested to hear some of the stories of DIO, Defence Infrastructure Organisation. We're going to hear about a fairly significant, fairly stunning actually, hangar building that was put up for them using NEC. The gentleman that's going to be talking to us is Jeff Davies. Jeff is an Associate Director with White Young Green and experienced project manager engineer, been with White Young Green since '97, 35 years of experience. And on the little bio that I was given, it's good to see that he's made the effort to become an accredited NEC, accredited project manager under the NEC.
Thank you, Richard, for those kind words. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to take you through a case study, as Richard said, based on a project I was involved with a few years ago now, known as the A400M Maintenance, Repair and Overhaul Facility at RAF Bryce Norton. As Richard said, I've worked for WIG for the past 22.5 years now. WIG is now, since last year, part of Tetra Tech, an American company. My experiences over the past 22 years has been primarily specialising in urban town expansion schemes, but I also spent some 7 years working in the defence sector. We'll start off with a quick view of the facility as it was nearing completion during the shell and core phase. You can see how the building sits into what is quite a busy area with lots of surrounding older hangars and other facilities, and you can see how close it is to the taxiway beside it. Next slide. I just should show. So just pop back a moment. So Cheryl, I meant to just point out that it's basically a 4-quadrant building. There's 3 hangars in there, plus workshops, and on the side you can see office facilities. Running through the agenda, we dealt with introductions. I'll touch on the project background, on the themes, NEC themes of building trust between parties, working collaboratively and transparently, achieving successful outcomes with NEC. Briefly, something about the project background. The RAF needed to replace its aging Hercules military transport aircraft a few years ago, so they set out to procure some 22 new Airbus A400 Atlas aircraft to be based at RAF Brize Norton, being commissioned between 2016 and 2021. Maintenance of the aircraft was to be undertaken at RAF Brize Norton in a new facility by Airbus Military, using embedded RAF personnel and employing a maintenance and repair overhaul organisation, which originally was Flybe. To enable the A400M to operate from Brize Norton, a new 3-bay hangar within the airfield was procured by the UK government through the Defence Infrastructure Organisation known as the DIO. DIO let the design and construction contract to Balfour Beatty in January 2015 through its NEC-based National Capital Works framework under a £42 million NEC3 engineering and construction contract using option A, price contract with activity schedule and milestone payments. The building was delivered in 2016 with a fit out to follow by Airbus. The building was formally opened in 2018. Here's a view of RAF Brize Norton from the air. As you can see, it's a fairly large site, very busy site. There's something like 10,000 people work there on a daily basis. Nearly all of that picture you can see is within the RAF area. And you can see just on the right-hand side of the site, I've indicated where the site was, next door to a taxiway and very close to the runway itself. All of this is inside the airfield, inside the perimeter of the airfield itself. Just a few statistics about the building: 130 meters long, 147 meters wide, and 28 meters high. It enclosed an area of 22,000 square meters, which, as I've said, included workshops, stores, welfare facilities, and offices. Overall, there were some 3,000 tons of steelwork, 8,200 cubic meters of attenuation tanks for rainfall, 6 overhead cranes, 5 rail-mounted sliding doors, 600 square meters of photovoltaic panels, and extensive concrete aprons. Just to have a look at some of the constraints. I've mentioned that working close to the taxiway and to the runway. The airbase remained active throughout the works. Of course, we had a considerable liaison to be able to work there at all. Airfields are very open and exposed, so weather and wind were key factors on the site, given the sort of construction we were undertaking. Repatriations on the site were a key consideration. RAF Brize Norton is the centre for repatriating any fallen service personnel, and when that happens, that the entire site has to come to a standstill out of a mark of respect. Airfield restrictions, the radar and the navigation aids that are used to help to land aircraft can be affected by any steelwork that's close to the beam. So the whole planning of the building and the construction had to be closely planned with the air traffic control representatives. I mentioned that the site was airside within the airfield, so therefore you cannot just drive to it. You have to have an airfield permit for driving. Any deliveries had to be chaperoned to get to the site by people who had airfield permits. So one of the things we were able to negotiate with the base was a designated access through a local crash gate, which shortened the distance. And still had to deal with security and everything else and the airfield driving, but the distance was considerably shortened, and that was really did help. The enabling works section of the overall project had to deliver a designated wildlife area right next to the site for the purpose of looking after local great-crested newt population. That presented many issues in just maintaining the fencing and making sure that there were no pollution incidents that could cause problems. And foreign object damage, FOD, any sort of packaging or anything like that could break loose and blow away and drift onto the taxiway or the runway could be sucked up into an engine and destroy that engine or even bring an aircraft down. So this was a very key consideration, the direction of fencing to try and capture it, and management procedures to make sure that no waste was left anywhere lying. It all had to be binned immediately. A quick look at a couple of cross sections through the building. You can see how the aircraft fits in there. The design had to accommodate the very high tailplanes of these aircraft, so the aircraft can only go in one way. And you can see how the crane zones sit above each of the aircraft. Quick resume of the project team. NEC3, the project manager role was taken formally by the DIO with support from ourselves as professional service providers. We were dealing with the design acceptances and compensation events and instructions and so on behalf of the DIO. The supervisor role was taken again by ourselves, and we had a man on site. The contract was let to Balfour Beatty. The designers were AWW Architects and Arabs, and one of the key decisions on the site was to maintain continuity of the design team. So AWW and Arab were there during the planning, the detailed design, the procurement, and the construction. And that latter was a decision made by Balfour Beatty to retain that team. NG Bailey came on board as part of Balfour Beatty's team to deliver the detailed service design. The project was delivered to BIM level 2, and you can see there's a shot from the BIM model on the screen. We found it very useful as another collaboration tool, and being able to sit down and resolve clash detection and so on. We're looking at the theme of building trust between the partners, and from the point of view of the client, it was absolutely crucial that the collaborative working ethos was deployed on this site. We really had to work hard with all of the people on the base, with the military and the civil servants around the base, to ensure that we could work, because if we weren't liaising with them properly, we simply couldn't work, basically. So in that respect, the contract's ethos of developing the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation was really important, and it was engendered right from the start. And in turn, that delivered a commitment to good practice and quality delivery on all parties, we found. I mentioned briefly the key relationships, and that really need to be worked on constantly, and develop the trust between parties, because basically that build-up of mutual trust and respect develops a sort of capital that you need later when, if any challenging events come up, as inevitably they do. A brief view from the point of view of Balfour Beatty. Yes, we mentioned it was a very, very busy airbase, and multiple stakeholders, just to name a few: security, air traffic control, health and safety, navigation, station liaison, environmental representatives, etc. Collaborative working was key. We developed a charter right at the outset to sit down and talk to the key stakeholders and identify their key drivers and objectives, and to sign up to a document that would help to crystallize that later on. We sat down on a weekly basis with all the stakeholders, calling in representatives from various organizations in and around the site to discuss upcoming activity, looking ahead 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, sort of, to make sure we took on board everybody's concerns and tried to deal with them logically. Here's a shot of the sort of operation that we're talking about. It needs key collaboration. This is the roof sheets being rolled out. That is a mobile form roller in the back of an Arctic truck being lifted up to height. A roof sheet that is up to 160 meters long is rolled out of there and formed, walked across the roof with a person every 10 yards or so, and laid in place. Conditions have to be pretty calm to do that, as you can imagine. So a brief shot of the project team. We held a steelworks ceremony shortly after we got going and invited the key stakeholders and local dignitaries. Fortunately, we got a very sunny day. In the centre of the picture, you can see the DIO project manager, Dennis Williams. So the theme of working collaboratively and transparently. The NEC processes were really helpful. I've mentioned the collaborative single team approach is crucial. The defined procedures and specified timescales help to develop transparency and resolve issues quickly. Compensation events were all managed using proprietary software supplied by Balfour Beatty. Again, that tended to help with transparency. Risk management was key on this project. We undertook it on an informal and formal basis, daily, weekly, monthly, with team and stakeholder involvement. I can remember doing this hourly sometimes, it seems to me. It's crucial on a job like this to keep looking ahead. There's a brief shot of a tandem lift underway. You can just make out there's a 9 meter deep steel trusses being just about to be lifted up into the air. Obviously, just behind us is a runway with aircraft flying in every 5 or 10 minutes or so. So that's all that steel going up. You can understand how that has a key effect on radar, etc. In a similar way, a different tandem lift, this time of the putting in the doors, the rolling doors. They required 3 cranes to lift them and manipulate them into place. And just over on the right, you can see the main runway, and in between there, that red and white fencing, that's the FOD fencing that I mentioned. So to summarize in terms of using NEC, good communication was paramount. I think that's probably true on most projects, but it was really incredibly necessary on this one. Continuous risk management, I've stressed this already. We positively welcomed early warnings. It seems counterintuitive sometimes, but knowing about the issues sufficiently early and being able to sit down and deal with them and mitigate them was very important. Transparency and collaboration develop trust, crucial to any project, I think. And the results, we had an excellent safety record on site and achieved a very good quality. I think the client was quite pleased. However, we did experience some change. I remember logging 120 compensation events. Some of those were positive, some of those were negative, as we dealt with some value engineering along the way. And the outturn, we had an uplift of approximately 4.7% above the contract value. That was within budget because the DIO carry a small risk budget on those contracts. And the handover was achieved to meet Airbus's fit-out program in September 2016. Brief look at an overview program spread out over about 5 years between gaining planning permission, dealing with enabling works, the detailed design, procurement, the stage, shell and core delivery by Balfour Beatty in blue, and then at the bottom of the program, the Airbus. A shot of the building as we were just handing it over. quite a large internal space, as you can see. There's 2 hangars there together. There's some offices on just in the centre of the screen, just to the left. You see it's quite a light and airy space to work in. And this is what it was all about. The aircraft fitted into the hangar. We were very pleased about that. It was one of the hangars was taken over early to undertake some early maintenance on aircraft engines, allowing me to be able to get this picture at the time. Finally, how the building fitted into its surroundings. It does seem to blend in on a perfect day with the blue cladding. And finally, a shot taken further back from near the A40, looking down the hill towards the base, the hangar in the sort of middle ground there. Thank you very much.
Jeff, thank you very much indeed for a fine presentation and a good story and a successful outcome of using NEC slightly more traditionally than the previous presentation. Sometimes we think of NEC, or a lot of people think of NEC as, yes, it's just for big infrastructure and the building sector, they still like their other forms of contract, but it's great to see a good example of NEC in a special building sector. I was particularly interested because, as I say, I'm working for DIO, so all those issues about getting onto site and whatever I'm currently struggling with on our project. Any questions, anybody? Last time it took a little bit of a time to get the things through. We're sort of lucky, don't tell Cheryl, but I'm lucky being the chair when we've got a big gap between the first half and the second half of the morning. Question from Rob Gerard: did you need to do any behavioural training to better understand that famous spirit of mutual trust and cooperation?
We didn't do any specific training. We spent a lot of time, as I said, working together and workshops and so on, and developing relationships, but no specific training. But I found we were a pretty good team. Just one of those teams that sometimes it clicked, and we didn't really need to do that.
It's all about. We always hear it's all about the people, but of course, NEC does tend to push people in the right directions. Those of us that think that NEC is a good thing. Question from Bafana Sanjay. A good story. Thank you very much. Any particular contractual challenges? Can I throw in one particular contractual challenge? NEC standard contract has no standard compensation event for wind. There's a lot of wind on your job. There was a lot of cranes shown in your pictures. Did you have any special compensation event for wind, or did you just leave that as a contractor risk?
Well, we did cover wind speeds, because we did define the local weather station to refer to, and there was a claim against wind, as I recall, but the claim wasn't successful. I think it was, as I recall now, it was based upon average wind speeds rather than peaks. It's a few years now, but the claim wasn't, the particular claim wasn't successful on weather.
That's just one interesting thing that people don't realise, that the NEC standard off-the-shelf clauses, compensation events for weather measurements, don't cover wind. Any other questions from anybody else out there? If not, there's still an opportunity, like we said, at the end of the patch. Otherwise, I'll lead you all in a round of virtual applause. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
And we'll move on. We'll move on to our third presentation. Sorry, Ross, for keeping you waiting a little bit. This next session, I'll tell you what, I'll let Ross introduce himself. He can do that very well. Ross, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine, my friend.
That's grand. Good morning, everybody. And it is still morning, I think. My name's Ross Hayes. I'm one of the NEC drafting team, and in particular looking today at the new facilities management contracts, which are due to come out hopefully before the end of the year. So we're moving, if you like, slightly in thinking away from the big project stuff towards the facilities management and term maintenance contract type of work. And what I thought we'd look at today is what's in the new contract, particularly the what, why, and where of the contracts, why they're needed, and why we're thinking of doing them, and then also to look a little bit later in the presentation just at the sort of issues of developing contract documentation, the things that we tend to know we have to do, but I really wanted to cover, if possible, the one or two of the specific problems or specific necessities of developing good contract documentation in an FM contract. So that's what we're looking at today, and looking at the whats and the whys, and then a little bit at the contract. So what are these new contracts? This is a new suite of contracts coming into the NEC suite. We already have the term service contracts, as you can see on the screen there, and we're going to be looking a little bit at the difference between this contract and that term service contract. But these are contracts that are specifically directed towards the FM sector, a very large sector, as I'll look at in a second, and it's aimed at them, so they are in the same class as the TSC contracts. They're for fixed periods of time, 5-year contracts, 10-year contracts, whatever, rather than being for the provision of a project. Firmly in the NEC style, we haven't moved away from the NEC approaches and NEC styles, firmly both for UK and international sectors, which has caused some interesting discussions and debates with the group of people in the last bullet point there, the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management. We've been working closely with IWFM to develop these contracts, and they obviously have contracts both overseas and at home, and want it to be able to work for both and work clearly in all parts of the world. So why have we bothered at all? It's a fair question. We have the term service contract already. Why are we concerned about a specific sector of the market? And I think the answer is stated fairly clearly. Those of you who were at last year's conference will have heard me give some of this talk before. And the first bullet point on there on the screen, which talked about the enormity of the sector in 2017, 7% of the UK's GDP, 10% of the UK workforce will not have changed. It was forecast to grow by up to 3% per year for the next 5 to 6 years. Clearly, the situation we're sitting in at the moment, which is why I'm doing this by video, has changed, but I suspect hasn't changed necessarily that proportion of the market. But it's a vast market. It's an enormous market. It's a hidden market often, and yet think how important it is. We rightly applaud the companies that managed to build the new hospitals for the Nightingale hospitals in such a quick time, and yet in behind them step the FM companies that maintain and run those hospitals, the sort of silent body behind it that makes it work. And that's the group of people that these contracts are looking to help. But of course, they're very small and very large. They can be hundreds of thousands of pounds, they can be hundreds of millions of pound contracts. They can be vastly complex. The contractual relationships, when we sat down and talked with IWFM of the different contractual relationships and the way these things are put together, we ended up with 10 different models that we could put together and different ways of fitting them together, with management contracting stuck in the middle of it and everything else. They're immensely variable. You can think of FM contracts running right across the whole market in various ways. And they range vastly different expertise in the client base. Some of the clients are very experienced. We've just been hearing about DIO. They use these contracts with significant experience in their industry, and they can be clients that have far less experience of running this type of contract. So what we want to try and achieve is a standard form of contract. I've got the NEC box there just as a picture. You've seen it so many, many times before. We all know the benefits of having standard contracts. And the benefit is particularly true in the FM market, where the FM market has got so many client-initiated bespoke contracts. We had a session with the industry before we started all this work, and up to 50% of all the contracts around the people in the room at that time had been written by the clients. And inevitably that creates differences. It means contractors have got to look at every contract very carefully. It's inefficient. It leads to all sorts of difficulties, and it's not the best way to go about it. So we're trying to get a standard form for the contract. The problem is that there's been resistance to the use of the term service contract by the FM sector. I'll look at that in a minute why, but that resistance to the use of the term service contracts has been part of the driver for creating this new contract. So what's wrong with the term service contract? Wrong's a bit of a pejorative word there. Why will it not want to use it? Well, it's too construction orientated. In its language is the comments that came back time after time after time. The industry does not use the word contractor. It uses the word service provider, as we'll come to see in a minute. It doesn't like this persistent emphasis on construction related type thinking and construction type language. And the TSC was very much developed from the back on the back of the engineering construction contract and retained much of the language. And I know we seem to be just talking about language and surely we can get over that problem. But the reality is it's a barrier, and it's a barrier that we needed to break and a barrier that needed to be changed. And similarly, it doesn't include all the procedures or all the specific details of the way the FM industry and sector works in its contractual relationships, as we've talked about, in some of its payment processes, as we'll see in a minute, in the fact that it needed call-off orders and the TSC didn't have it. And in the UK, that's a UK one, obviously only for the 2P regulations. Do we need to think about it or not? And if we don't, how do we build it into the contracts? So there's a lot of ways that the term service contract didn't really quite push the right buttons for the FM industry. So rather than try and rework it round, as many have, I mean, nearly every major road contract in this country is running on a term service contract. It was many of the industry just turned away and turned their back on it. And we thought, this is silly, we need to do something about it. The problem is we can never have a standard contract that does everything. Because we're talking about a variable industry across a vast sector of the work in this country, we can't have a standard contract that does everything. And that's been one of the tensions in trying to write this contract. Yes, they need the detail. The sector says we need this, we need that, we need something else. And yet it's only part of the sector that needs it and other parts don't. So how can we help that and move that through? So that's the why. That's in a sense why it's necessary, what we're doing with it, what's being provided. And again, those of you who were here last year will have heard me talk some about this, as that was still on the stocks then. It's a full suite of contracts, the full major contract, the facilities management contract, and the subcontract that goes with it. And then the subcontract, the short form facilities management short contract. And then we're providing to a short subcontract form, which in fact the TSC suite doesn't provide. Together with that, all the standard user guides and the standard flowcharts. They are probably being provided in the first case electronically rather than in paper form. I'm sorry, Richard, I really don't know what colour it's going to be. Somebody else, I have no idea. We're running out of colours. It may have to be 2 colours and have a 2-colour form just to be different. Sorry. So additionally, though, the intention is that there will be the user guides developed as prompts, and that they're just working the user guides through now, finishing them off, but working to see what extra information needs putting into them to help those clients, as we've said, who are not necessarily used to doing these contracts, but need the big form because it's a big contract for them. So the user guides are being developed in probably more extensively than we're used to. But we've recognised too that we need more specific guidance for specific needs and sectors. So we will be having different specialist forms and specialist information going out, probably electronically, undoubtedly electronically, on, for example, how to put together, as we'll see in a minute, a performance table, and how to put together its use in the UK rather than using overseas. And equally, of course, for those of you who are listening from overseas, and notice that are many here from overseas, how you would use this in the particular country that you're working. And we would be looking, I think, this would be probably a first, we'd be looking to the users to help provide some of that material and build it into the library, if you like, of guidance that's available for these sorts of contracts. So let's look at a few differences and a few things that have been put in very, very briefly. These are sort of for the more contractual geeks amongst us. We have changed the language As I said, we're no longer talking about a contractor, but a service provider. The sector still talks about subcontractors, so those words remain. We have no longer got tasks and task orders. We've got projects and project orders, because the work is commonly called a project that a contractor, a service provider would be undertaking. A big one is, and we'll look at it more importantly in a moment, is service failures, not defects. In the construction world, we are used to having a defect, something, well, not used to it, we don't want to see them, but we have them, something that is not quite up to the specification we want, which can then be put right. In the service sector, in the maintenance sector, we often get failures to the service which are not necessarily able to be put right, and we need to deal with that issue. They are failures to provide the service rather than a defect. The language of defects is very much construction orientated. We have 3 new procedures. The call-off order is the fundamental one. We have many of the maintenance sectors, you have a fairly standard call-off approach. The landlord, the tenant, rings up the organisation and saying, I've got a failure in a toilet block, I need a cleaning service doing, I've got lights that don't work, I've got doors that don't work, my lift is failing. All sorts of areas where there's a fairly standard piece of work required, but we don't know when. And that process has been put into the contract, together with something called service order requirements, which I'm going to look at in a moment or two. We've created a performance table. For those of you who know the design, build and operate contract, you'll have met this before. This effectively is a statement of what it is that I want as a client. What do I expect from my service provider? How I'm going to measure that performance, how I'm going to report that performance, and what I'm going to do with it once I've got it. And that can be plus or minus, positive or negative, and that is all put together in a performance table. And it doesn't take much imagination to realize just how important that document is. Possibly on a smaller level, but equally important in many ways, clients, we brought in mobilization and demobilization plans. You don't normally start a 5-year M&E maintenance contract without having some form of mobilization up front to say, how am I going to do it? What am I going to do? How am I going to assess the assets I've got? What level of work has to be done in advance? And equally, what do I want at the end of the contract? What do I expect the service provider to provide me for the next service provider? So those have been brought in as hooks, if you like, to hang the information on. We have 3 new secondary options, 2 of which you'll recognize, those of you who know the contracts. And we brought design into this contract. The idea that you might have a maintenance contractor doing no design at all is probably wishful thinking. The reality is that they frequently are, and we wanted to have the design capacities brought through from the ECC contracts. Task orders have become project orders and have moved into the secondary option as no longer in core, as the term service contract has it, because we've got the call-off orders in core and most of the work goes through those. And we brought in a new option for the change of control so that a client can have the option to stop a contract because the governance of their service provider has changed to somebody they cannot accept. They may be a competitor, for example, and that clause has been asked for by a very large number of clients. 2 examples of what we've changed, and I've mentioned the first one already, is this concept of a service failure. Clearly, we may have something going wrong, but it cannot be corrected. You may have said, for example, that you want all your waste disposals to be done before 7:30 in the morning, and it isn't. It's done at 8 o'clock in the morning, or it hasn't been done at all. There's no way that you can correct that particular failure. So the contract has been written to take account of this, and clearly some of the implications of those failures may be routed through a performance table against key performance indicators, for example. And then we've looked again at the insurance issues and the way that we had a double sort of insurance situation in the term service contract, because the property, the building, the roads, the asset is often insured by the client anyway. So do we really need the service provider insuring it as well? So that has been, the default position has been reversed. And in this case, the client insures that property unless they request the service provider to do so. And everything obviously has to then follow suit in all the different areas of liability. So lastly, just for a couple of minutes, let's think about the documentation, because fundamentally contract documentation is the most important thing. I want to pick up just a couple of examples, but the effort of getting documentation right, I don't need to say that to this audience really. The time you spend is always well worth spent. And I want to just look at two things: the service orders and the service order requirements and the performance table. The service order, our call-off order, is the order, simply is the order given to the service provider to undertake some work. Identified in the service order, that should say service order requirements. My apologies for the mistake on that first bullet. Essentially, the service order requirements tells you what you can instruct. And the prices are already there in an option A or C contract. We've already got some price determined for it. It is the service order requirements which is the fundamental. It tells you how you can order something. It tells you what's the process for that order, and it tells you the constraints on it. So the effort is required in drawing up those service order requirements. And this slide just shows a few thoughts of how to put it together, and also begins to bring in some of the language that some of you listening may not be used to because you don't work in this particular area. But we have an issue often that the service provider can undertake work without being instructed by a service manager. We have clients who turn around and say, if a service provider walks in and sees something needs doing, I want them to do it. We can work out how we pay for it, work out the payment afterwards, but I don't want them to come and ask me, just fix it. So how is that managed? Who records the orders issued and who records how the work is done? We have pricing structures in our industry often that is a semi-comprehensive or fully comprehensive price. Clearly, if it's a fully comprehensive price and the service provider has said, whatever goes wrong, it's included in my price, that's easy. But the client still wants to know what work has been done, still needs to have it recorded so that they understand how their asset is being managed. And if it's a semi-comprehensive price where the contract service provider, forgive me, you can see how easily I slip into the wrong language too. If the service provider will pay for work up to say £1,000, how do you manage the authorization? The service provider walks along and says this is going to cost 2,000. And how do we handle the aggregation of small orders? Those of you who are working in these sort of areas will know all these problems and all these questions. It's not new, but we've put it together in the service order requirements so that it can be well structured and well understood by the service providers when tendering for their pricing. And the performance table is the other one. How am I going? What is it that I really want? It states the targets for the service providers to achieve and then sets out an adjustment to payment if it's higher, the same or lower. It is not in the scope. The performance table essentially is not in the scope, but can be changed through the scope, through the contract rather, by a compensation event. It doesn't describe the service that's elsewhere, that is in the scope. And that can obviously be changed by the service manager. So writing this performance table is absolutely core. Often traditionally done through key performance indicators. But how are they measured? When are they measured? Who measures them? What's the absolute best I can expect? What's the absolute worst I will tolerate? Performance targets, they can obviously be adjustments to the service period. They can be benefits. They can be deductions. I may be measuring lots and lots of KPIs, but only using a few for performance targets. The only thing that's different from the DBO way of doing it is that the target price process has been left in the contract data and not brought into this performance table. So that's the performance table. So, Richard, that's
okay, Ross,
of that particular piece of work that's hopefully going to be published before the end of the year.
Okay, well, Ross, we look forward to that. Thank you very much for a very clear presentation. For those NEC specialists and people on the call, I'm sure there will be hopefully some interest. I personally have given training on the TSC, as you know, and you are Ross. If you don't know people on the call, Ross is Mr. TSC. So now he's got to be Mr. TSC plus FM, just to confuse the poor chap. Thank you very much for the presentation. Any questions on that? Any FM people out there, I wonder, or are you all construction people? I'm not sure. My apologies that the overall session this morning has run over by 10 minutes or so. I hope that's not a problem to anybody, because I think they've all been 3 very, very good presentations. Do we have any questions for Ross specifically, or indeed any other more general questions about the other 3 presentations, or indeed anything else even more general if you like? Anybody come? Okay, 1, 2 from Mr. Gerard, is always helping us out. Thank you, Rob, sat over there in Hong Kong fighting the fall. Do you think the FM contract might merge with the TSC in time, or are the industries they serve different, so different?
This is a political question, really. I think the reality.
Are you suggesting Mr. Gerard is a politician? Go on,
no,
carry on.
No, I'm suggesting I need to be. To be honest, I think there are so many improvements in the FM contract, because as we have gone through the term service contracts rigorously, we have found things that we think we could do better. I think that FM contract may well in time replace the term service contract. But what I would say is that doesn't mean that the term service contract doesn't work. The term service contract has clearly been used for many years. It is being used on lots of major contracts. Those people who are using it shouldn't think, oh my goodness, it doesn't work, I should change it. No. But people coming in from scratch thinking, I want the NEC, should seriously think about using the FMC rather than the term service.
Yeah, I guess that's the question. If you're quotes providing a service that you might not think as FM, would you start with the TSC or would you start with this new FM? I mean, for example, there's a classic story is that there's a term service contract for running a boat across Lake Manapuri in New Zealand. Would you start with the FM contract or the TSC?
I think the issue probably would be
Good comment from Ian. I think the NEC will be guided by users as to whether there is a continuing demand. That's a fairly obvious thing. Although having said that, it's always very difficult to know quite how much these things are being used. Comment from Sean. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Do you think that some aspects can be adopted within the TSC? And this the concepts of the one thing I noticed. I've given training on the TSC, is that the TSC doesn't have this routine service order stuff. That just has to be a normal process written into the scope. This is the way we do stuff. And that's a new thing in the FM. I guess that's the question. Do you think some of these things could be stolen from the FMC back into the TSC?
Sure.
I'm sure it could be. And I'm sure, Ross, you've drafted it in such a way that would be possible.
Yes, I'm sure it is. There is an answer that comes with, if you keep on stealing so much from one, why not go and use the one you've stolen it from in the first place?
Yeah, of course.
But yes, clearly. And for example, the new one on change of control option, I will not be surprised if that doesn't become a standard option for all any future NEC contracts.
Which one was that? Sorry, I missed that. Which?
The X28 change of control, for example.
Okay, right, yeah.
It's a standalone option that can easily be put into any other contract.
Question here from Ian Stubbs. It's good to hear a quick idea of the key difference between a service order and a project order. And I'm going to guess that the project order's got a date to it, and a service order probably hasn't, but I'm not sure.
Let's take a typical contract, a lift maintenance contract where you have a standard service to look after the lift for a year. That is the standard service. You may have a call-off order because somebody has got stuck in it, or because somebody's put a spike through a control panel, or a switch isn't working. That's a call-off order. I know it's going to need doing, I just don't know when. The project order could be the refurbishment of the lift. So you might have an office block with 16 lifts in it, full maintenance project contract, and then once a year or every year we'll refurbish one of those. So a project order is a piece of work that is anticipated will be wanted, but needs a program to it. It needs I want. It's going to impact on the user. If I take a lift out of use for 6 weeks, it's going to impact on the users of the building. So I need a program and I need more information on it.
Yeah, which is sort of fits with the task logic that we've got in the current situation.
The task order approach. But
Yeah.
what we've done, the NEC4 made task orders more project orientated and bigger in terms of needing quotations. And therefore they left that gap of a call off order in the middle of it. The contract filled the gap.
One specific question here. What happened to BIM? Have we got an X10 for BIM in the FM contract, or
It is there. Yes,
it is there. Okay.
It's there. It's an interesting question what you use it for. The answer may well be you could link your asset management structure, asset management maintenance
system
to it, or you could, of course, require the maintenance the facilities management service provider to update and maintain the existing
the model. That would make sense if that's the way the world is going, isn't it?
Yeah.
Couple of just generic questions. Good to know when it's going to be available electronically. I don't know whether we have a date for that. Anybody in NEC, let me know. But coming soon, I think, is going to be the answer. Cheryl, thank you for pointing out that the presentation slides from today will be up on the website by the end of this week, says Cheryl. She's giving herself a very good target. Any other questions? Anybody else out there? Oh, this is me causing problems. In the last presentation, it was mentioned that wind doesn't allow for a compensation event under NEC 3. Isn't 60.113 relevant? Now, the issue there, sorry, this is Bafana. That was me chipping in. It's on that previous contract on the DIO issue. That was just a point that the standard weatherments in NEC do not include for wind. So the contractor is protected from anything above a 1 in 10 year event for the weather measurements in italics as identified in the contract data. And the weather measurements don't have anything for wind. And the problem with wind is it's very messy to try and give a 1 in 10 year for what? For what sort of wind? How gusty? Whatever. And generally, we suggest that people have a separate compensation based on the amount of time that cranes on the site can't actually work. But that's a thing to look out for. On the A14 presentation are outline headline details of the amendments available for those wanting to emulate the success of the project. That's one for Cheryl, I think, to ask the guys from Highways England to ask Graham. Is Graham still on the line? I don't know whether there might be some way of you guys making public some of the things that you did to the contract. The idea of just deleting section 6 sounds very simple, but I'm sure it was a little more to it.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
I don't see any reason why that can't be shared. We do a number of different presentations with Network Rail, HS2, etc. So we try to spread as wide as possible. If the guy would like to get in touch with me, we can have a conversation and we can go into some more detail.
Okay, so I suggest if you don't mind, Cheryl, go through Cheryl to ask that particular question. Yeah. But again, I obviously from an NEC perspective, it would be nice to see a little bit more detail about those issues. And I'm sure that Cheryl can find a way that the NEC can share them more widely to NEC people, if that's okay with you, Graham, and Highways England.
That would be excellent.
One question for Ross: is the FM contract intended for international use? I'm sure that's a yes. And are any other countries aware or involved in this, Ross?
It has been written, like all NEC contracts, to allow its use internationally, in as much as the NEC is not legally dependent on any national legal system.
In the normal NEC.
In the normal NEC route. In terms of have other countries been involved in the development of it, in as much as some of the people on the board working with the Institute of Workplace Facilities Management have been heavily involved in cross-national as part of international contracts, there has been some involvement. In as much as we've had anybody specifically from overseas on it, you'd have to ask Elizabeth at the NEC. but
Yeah.
I'm not directly sure of it. And one of the interesting problems, the interesting issues with the really large cross-national contracts is that you do have FM contracts which run right across, for example, the European community,
Yeah.
where the law of the contract may be one thing, but the operating law of the various parts of it may be, you get somebody working in 6 different countries.
That will get very, very
and
interesting.
There's no way to write a contract for that. I think that's one of these classics where you have to look at the specific of your contract and decide if it's an issue.
Okay, can I just pass on to everybody still on the call? And there are still a good few of you on the call. If you do have any specific questions for speakers, that more detail that you haven't felt able to ask just now, if you can just email them to the normal NEC info@neccontract.com. That's info@neccontract.com. And somebody in our fine NEC team will forward those on to the appropriate person. So we're way over time, so apologies for my hopeless chairing for not telling people to do things quicker. I'm sorry, but it's great having a gap in the morning. I hope many of you will come back at 12:30 for the mock adjudication, which I'm sure will be informative and fun. We have Patrick Waterhouse, Nicholas Gold and Jeremy Glover, the latter two from Fenwick and Elliott lawyers. I'm sure that will be a good session at 12:30. So it just remains for me to thank again all the speakers, Ross, Graham, John and Jeff for their fine presentations. And we look forward to seeing you later on this afternoon.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
That unknown participant is now exiting. I hope you heard that as well. So thank you very much and have a good rest of day. Bye now.